All right, UPSC warriors, we got to stay on top of current affairs. So let's deep dive into something that's making headlines. The U.S. and their new steel and aluminum tariffs. And what they could mean for India. We're using the Indian Express and CNBC for this one, so you know it's the real deal. And this is going to be useful for both mains and prelims. Think international relations, economics, you name it. So get those notes ready. Let's jump in.
Yeah, sounds like there's a lot to cover.
Oh, absolutely. Because Trump's back at it with those tariffs. This time it's a 25% duty on steel and aluminum imports. And get this, even on allies. So everyone's asking, what's this going to do to India?
Well, the initial reaction in India hasn't been great. The Nifty Metal Index dropped 3%, and big companies like Tata Steel and JSW Steel saw their shares fall by 4%.
Whoa, that's a big drop. Why are investors so spooked?
Well, think about it from the Indian steel and aluminum producers' side. If their exports to the U.S. get hit with a 25% tariff, they're not going to be as competitive. And that could mean less revenue, which obviously makes the markets nervous.
Right, less competitive, less revenue, not a good mix. And this is the kind of thing that could be on the UPSC exam, right? I mean, this market volatility shows how global events can impact the Indian economy.
Absolutely. It shows how connected global trade is and how one country's policies can cause a chain reaction everywhere. But speaking of past experiences, remember what happened back in 2018 when the U.S. did something similar?
Oh yeah, 2018, wasn't that a crazy time for the Indian steel industry?
It was countries that were really dependent on exporting steel to the U.S. had to find new markets fast. And a lot of that steel ended up in India, which led to a surge in cheap imports.
So India got flooded with cheap steel. What happened then? Did domestic prices crash?
Exactly. Domestic steel prices went way down, and that put a ton of pressure on Indian steel producers. It wasn't good.
Ouch, that sounds rough. So could that happen again? And what about China dumping steel in India? They'll be looking for new markets if the U.S. closes up.
Those are the big questions, and the ones Indian policymakers are definitely thinking about. Now, here's where things get interesting. India's direct steel exports to the U.S. aren't that huge. It's about $450 million in 2024. Aluminum exports are a bit higher, around $820 million.
So it's not nothing, but not a giant chunk of our exports either.
Right, especially compared to a country like Canada. They made up almost 80% of U.S. aluminum imports in 2024. So India's exposure seems pretty limited.
Okay, so maybe there's a bright side. Maybe we're not as vulnerable as we think.
Well, hold on a second. While our direct exports might not be huge, we can't forget about the global economy. There are always indirect impacts and ripple effects.
Right, it's like a giant game of chess. Every move has consequences. So what happens when you hit big players like China, the EU, or South Korea with these tariffs? They're not just going to sit there, are they?
Exactly. They might retaliate. We could see counter tariffs on U.S. goods, just like what happened when the EU retaliated in 2018.
Ah, classic tit for tat. It's like a trade war waiting to happen.
And this is a perfect example of how complex international trade relations are, especially for the UPSC exam. Understanding these dynamics is key for those international relations questions and mains, but it's not just about retaliation. There's also trade diversions.
Trade diversions. What's that?
Well, if China can't easily sell steel to the U.S. anymore, they'll have to find other markets. And that could mean flooding countries like India with cheaper steel, even if India isn't the U.S.'s target.
Okay, that's a sneaky twist. So even if we're not directly targeted, we could still get caught in the crossfire. Not exactly a comforting thought. But let's change gears a bit. We've talked about the problems, but what about solutions? How does India handle this situation?
Well, there are a few strategies India could try. One is diversifying our export markets so we're not so reliant on one country, especially one that makes unpredictable trade decisions.
You're being diplomatic. But yes, spreading the risk makes sense. What else is on the table?
Another key strategy is boosting domestic demand for steel. If we can use more of our own steel, it would soften the blow from potential export losses. And then there's government intervention.
Ah, yes, the government always has some tricks up its sleeve. What kind of intervention are we talking about?
Tools like safeguard duties.
Safeguard duties. Now, for our listeners who might not be familiar with all the jargon, can you explain what those are and how they work?
Think of safeguard duties as a temporary shield for Indian steelmakers. They're basically temporary tariffs on imports to protect domestic industries from sudden surges of cheap imports.
So it's like leveling the playing field and giving domestic producers a chance to compete.
Exactly. And another tool the government could use is expanding production-linked incentive, PLI schemes. These are designed to boost domestic manufacturing.
Our UPSC aspirants, write that down. PLI schemes, definitely something that could come up in your economics or governance papers.
Absolutely. Understanding these policy tools is key for anyone interested in how the government can intervene in the economy. But beyond these specific measures, there's the bigger question of how India positions itself in this increasingly volatile global trade environment.
Right, because it feels like the rules are always changing. So what's the long game for India? How do we not just survive, but thrive in this new world order.
Well, one key focus has to be on investing in innovation and technology to make our steel industry more efficient and competitive globally.
So basically, upping our game so we can handle whatever comes our way.
Exactly. It's about building resilience and adaptability.
Okay, so we've got diversification, domestic demand, government intervention, and a long-term focus on innovation. Sounds like India has a lot to do.
It does, and for you UPSC aspirants, this is a prime example of how economic trends, policy decisions, and global events are all connected.
Absolutely. It's like a real-world case study happening right now. And speaking of things happening, we've covered a lot in part one of our deep dive. We've looked at the initial market reaction, the potential risks, and some strategies India could use. But there's another important dimension we need to explore: how all of this could impact you, the consumer.
That's right. Economics ultimately comes down to how it affects people's lives. So stay tuned for part two, where we'll dive into how these steel tariffs could impact your wallet and the prices of everyday things. Welcome back to our deep dive on those U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs.
So far, we've been talking about the big picture stuff: global trade wars, government policies, how the markets are reacting. But let's get real. How could these tariffs actually affect the average person in India? Like, is my chai going to get more expensive?
Well, let's hope not. But you've hit on a key point. Prices steel isn't practically everything, from construction and infrastructure to manufacturing and all the stuff we buy.
Yeah, steel's not just for those giant factories. It's in our cars, appliances, even our homes.
Exactly. So if steel gets more expensive, it'll probably make a lot of other things more expensive too.
Okay, so that's one possibility. Prices go up if companies have to deal with the tariffs. But wait, didn't we also talk about India potentially getting flooded with cheap imported steel because of those trade diversions? Wouldn't that actually make prices go down?
You're right to bring that up. It's a double-edged sword. Cheaper imports might sound good at first, but like we saw in 2018, it can really hurt domestic producers, and in the long run, that weakens the whole industry.
Right, cheaper prices aren't so great if they end up destroying our own steel industry. It's a tough balancing act for the government.
It is. They have to think about consumers, domestic industries, and the overall economy. It's not easy.
It's like a Rubik's Cube. Every move has consequences. But speaking of the government, what can they actually do to soften the blow of these tariffs? We talked about safeguard duties and PLI schemes earlier. Are those their main options?
Safeguard duties can help for a bit. They increase the cost of imported steel and give domestic producers some breathing room. But there are other things they can do too.
Like what? Tell me more.
They could give targeted support to domestic steel producers, maybe subsidies or tax breaks that could help them stay competitive even with cheaper imports.
Interesting. But wouldn't that go against the whole idea of free trade? Shouldn't we just let the market do its thing?
That's a good point. There's always that tension between protectionism and free trade. And in situations like this, governments have to make tough choices.
Choices that probably have political consequences, too. If the government seems like it's favoring one industry over another or consumers over producers, that's going to cause some problems.
Definitely, trade policy is always political, and in a diverse democracy like India with so many different people and interests, it's a real tightrope walk.
Okay, so we've got safeguard duties, targeted support, and a whole lot of politics involved. But what about the long term? How should India position itself in this crazy global trade environment? It feels like there are always new tariffs, trade wars, sanctions. It's like the Wild West out there.
You're not wrong. That's why resilience is so important, and one way to build that is by diversifying our export markets. We can't rely too much on one country, especially one known for changing its mind about trade.
You're being tactful again, but I get it. Not putting all our eggs in one basket is a smart move. What else can we do to be prepared for the future?
Investing in innovation and technology is key. We need to make our steel industry more efficient, more competitive, and more sustainable.
So leveling up our game so we can compete globally no matter what.
Exactly. It's about being adaptable and thinking ahead.
All right, so we've talked about how these tariffs could affect prices, the balancing act the government has to do, and the long-term strategies India could use. But there's one more important piece we need to talk about: the environment.
That's right. Steel production, especially the traditional way it's done, is a big contributor to greenhouse gases. We can't ignore its environmental impact, especially with climate change.
Right, because making steel requires a lot of heat and energy. Usually that means burning fossil fuels, which isn't good for the planet.
Exactly. Traditional steelmaking uses a lot of coal, and coal is a major source of carbon dioxide emissions. In fact, the steel industry is responsible for something like 7% to 9% of global CO2 emissions.
Wow, that's a lot. So the more steel we make, the more we contribute to climate change.
Basically, yes. And with the demand for steel expected to keep growing thanks to things like urbanization and infrastructure projects, this is a serious problem.
Okay, this is starting to sound a bit depressing. Is there any way to make steel production more sustainable?
There is. Luckily, there's a lot of innovation happening. One of the most promising things is green steel.
Green steel, that sounds cool. What is that?
Green steel is all about moving away from those old coal-powered blast furnaces and using cleaner technologies. Think electric arc furnaces powered by renewable energy sources like solar and wind. And these furnaces can also use recycled scrap steel, which reduces the carbon footprint even more.
So basically making the steel industry electric and using cleaner energy. That's awesome.
It is, and there are other innovations coming too, like using hydrogen instead of carbon in the process.
Hydrogen-powered steel making. That sounds like something out of the future. But seriously, are these green steel technologies actually being used, or are they just ideas?
They're moving from ideas to reality. Some countries, especially in the European Union, are investing a lot in green steel production.
And what about India? Where do we stand with green steel?
India is making progress too. The government has set big goals for renewable energy and is encouraging green technologies in a lot of industries, including steel.
That's good to hear. So it seems like there's a global race to make the steel industry green, but I bet it's not easy, right? There must be economic and policy challenges.
You're right. Green steel technologies are often more expensive than traditional methods, at least in the beginning. So governments need to offer incentives and policies to make them more affordable.
Because in the end, steel producers need to be able to compete globally.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the steel tariffs we've been talking about. If India wants to promote green steel production, it needs to make sure everyone's playing by the same rules.
So are we talking about things like carbon tariffs on imports from countries that aren't doing enough to reduce emissions?
That's one option. It's complicated, but it needs attention. The future of the steel industry and the planet depends on our ability to make this industry cleaner.
Well, that's the end of part 2 of our deep dive. We've talked about how these tariffs could affect consumers, the challenges and opportunities of green steel, and all the complicated policy decisions facing the government.
It's been a fascinating discussion so far.
And for you UPSC aspirants, remember, this is a multifaceted issue that connects to economics, international relations, environmental policy, and even technology. Make sure you understand the key ideas and arguments.
And if you have any questions or want to learn more about something specific, leave a comment below. We're always happy to chat with our fellow deep divers.
And don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this episode with your fellow UPSC warriors.
Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll wrap up our discussion and share some final thoughts on what the future might hold for the Indian steel industry.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive. We've been talking about steel tariffs and their impact on India. But for all you UPSC aspirants out there, let's step back and think big picture. What does this all mean for India's long-term economic strategy?
That's a great question. This situation really shows how important it is for India to not rely too much on any single market, especially one that's known for making sudden policy changes.
Yeah, diversification, we talked about that before. But what does that actually look like? How do we do it?
It means actively looking for new export markets, strengthening our trade relationships with other countries, and building supply chains that can handle disruptions.
So basically, don't put all our eggs in one basket. Makes sense. What else should India be focusing on?
Investing in those next-generation technologies is key. Green steel production, hydrogen-powered furnaces, all that stuff. It's not just hype, it's the future.
Okay, diversification and innovation, got it. But those are long-term plans. What about right now? How does India deal with these tariffs in the short term?
Well, the government has to walk a tightrope. They need to protect domestic producers from being flooded with cheap imports. That's where safeguard duties come in. But they also can't forget about consumers, who might face higher prices if the government gets too protectionist.
It's a tough choice, protecting our industries versus making sure people can afford things.
It is. And then there's the whole global situation to consider. We've seen how trade disputes can turn into tariff wars, and nobody wins in that scenario.
Yeah, trade wars are bad news. So what's the best way forward for India? How do we protect ourselves without starting a trade war?
Diplomacy is key. We need strategic negotiations and strong alliances with other countries. India needs to be a strong voice in the global conversation, advocating for fair trade practices and a more stable trading environment.
It's not just about reacting, it's about shaping the future of trade. I like it.
Exactly. And for our UPSC audience, this whole situation is a perfect example of how economics, international relations, domestic politics, and even the environment are all connected.
It's a real-world case study happening right now, and I think we've done a great job breaking it down today.
Agreed. We've looked at how producers, consumers, and the environment might be affected, talked about the government's options, and even explored the future of steelmaking.
So there you have it, a deep dive into the U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs and what they mean for India. Remember, this kind of topic could pop up on your UPSC mains or prelims exam, so make sure you've got a good understanding of all the key ideas.
And if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to leave a comment below. We love hearing from you.
And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your fellow UPSC warriors. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a hot topic.
Until then, happy studying.
Oh, and one last thing. All the info we talked about today came from reports in the Indian Express and CNBC. Check those out for more details. See you next time.